All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Butler. I'm the Manager of Policy and Research at the Ontario Good Roads Association. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this second webinar that we've brought to you, looking to bring ideas, perspective, insights into how municipalities should be responding during the COVID-19 pandemic. Last week, our webinar focused on the issue of maintenance of municipal roadways and the management of liability during this crisis. This week, we're turning our attention to municipal road construction projects and how the COVID-19 pandemic has been impacting the maintenance and execution of those projects. Before I introduce our panel, I would like to acknowledge at this time three organizations that have been very generous with their time and connections. First is the Ontario Road Builders Association. Since its inception in 1927, ORBA has been the voice of the road building industry. It represents the interest of contractors as well as goods and service providers within the transportation sector in Ontario. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, also known as RESCON. RESCON is Ontario's leading association of residential builders committed to providing leadership and fostering innovation within the sector. Finally, I want to acknowledge RCCAO, the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. RCCAO and OGRA have partnered on a number of initiatives recently, including the Environmental Assessment Reform Initiative, as well as the Project Bundling Initiative. The contribution each of these organizations has provided us for today's webinar have been invaluable. Now, with that on the table, I also want to introduce our panel. Richard Lyall is the president of RESCON and formerly a director with RCCAO. He's widely acknowledged as a leading advocate for health and safety issues within the construction sector. Richard will be sharing his insights on those issues with us today. We're also joined on this webinar by Bryan Hocking, CEO, and Andrew Hurd, Director of Policy and Stakeholder Relations for the Ontario Road Builders Association. And finally, representing an individual contractor perspective is James McVeety from Black & McDonald Limited. James is also currently serving as the president of ORBA's board of directors. So the way this will unfold today is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to run us through what they're hearing on the construction file from the perspective of their various organizations. After we have done that, we are going to have a question and answer session. I would invite folks to use the Q&A module that you'll see in the Zoom pop-up. Any questions posed in there, we'll be monitoring that and we'll be posing those to the panel. I would ask you to make use of that as much as possible. We'll also monitor the chat function, lest any questions get posed there. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Richard Lyall to run us through the health and safety perspective and what he's been hearing in the last few days. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. This is quite a challenge, as you know. We've attacked it on a number of fronts. First and foremost was the safety issue. We quickly developed a protocol, worked with our partners, other sectors of the industry through our Construction and Design Alliance, which includes the engineers and architects. We turned that around fast, got it into the IHSA. It was signed off there by the co-chairs, and then it went to the Ministry of Labor. And of course, you know, the Ministry of Labor earlier this week issued its guidelines. The guidelines are on the website there, on the MOL website. They're quite clear, they're well written, and they detail what the basic minimum standard is for performance on site. The implementation of many of those measures were already in place beforehand. You know, the industry had to pivot very quickly to meet these new standards and so on, and many of them make a great deal of sense in any event. Of course, this has had an effect on production. We've also seen an effect on our labor supply because, of course, if nobody wants to work, they don't have to. So that has, and with all the chaos around this in recent weeks, that has resulted in certain uncertainty in labor supply, absenteeism, and that kind of thing. And we've got various estimates depending on various subtrades and sectors of the construction industry, how that effect is taking place. In recent days, I guess the good news is we're getting very good feedback from the sites. Ministry inspectors are out doing their jobs. There have been 3 shutdowns so far, but out of a few, I think hundreds of inspections done so far, that's pretty good. But there are many orders issued, so there are things that need to be improved. And of course, you know, the challenge with PPE, personal protective equipment, has been significant. So, but that's improving every day, and the reports I'm getting are very positive. And of course, anybody who's not abiding by those guidelines or refusing to or ignoring them or somehow, you know, they should be shut down. There's no question about that. This is also resulting in certain innovative measures, and you know, we're looking at various applications in terms of how to track people, and you know, we're going to be talking. In fact, I think it's going on right now with the CPO to have a better understanding of what those orders are about and areas that we need to focus on. But we're confident that we can work safely in this environment. And of course, all this depends on our supply chain holding up, but we're not seeing major issues there yet. But that may come depending on how long this lasts. So, and I'll look forward to any questions that anyone might have going forward, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to turn it over to you, Bryan. Run us through what you're hearing from your membership who've been involved, who are obviously on the front lines in terms of these projects.
Okay, thanks, Scott. We'll do it in 3 parts as far as ORBA is concerned, and I'll deal with the approach to the provincial and federal governments, and James will deal with how contractors are coping and the ORBA response, and then Andrew will provide comments on the relief provisions everybody's interested in. Just to start with, just make note that our members directly or indirectly employ about 56,000 people. A lot of workers out there in our membership. Safety, of course, is our first consideration always, but especially now, as Richard has just stated quite well. I want to assure you that members of ORBA are taking all necessary precautions for health and safety of employees and the public while continuing to deliver an important infrastructure projects as designated essential service. So our priorities since this situation began, in the general order of sequence, is number 1, ensuring safety first approach. We spent a lot of time dealing with that in-house and with other associations. Number 2, operations and pipeline continuity to make sure that business continues. And number 3, ensuring fairness for all parties, and James will speak more about that shortly. Our approach generally is a 2-pronged approach. First, ORBA to government directly, something that we do on a regular basis and have done continuously since this crisis occurred. So that's a direct approach to government from ORBA. The second prong of that approach should be ORBA through alliances to government, CCA, federal level, CDAO at the provincial level. I've said throughout the last while, there's one thing we've learned through this crisis is that we know now that all of our sister organizations, we can all come together and we can work very effectively for positive outcomes. I think it's something that will continue in the long run, and I think is a benefit to everyone that we're doing things like this together. Through our alliances, we're working to set up regular discussions, including senior representatives of various ministries and agencies, including Municipal Affairs and MOL, to complement our association to government conversations. Before I turn things over to the President, I'd like to offer some observations on what I've been seeing and hearing just recently. First of all, the majority of our companies are continuing to work. A few have suspended operations for a period of 2 weeks or so. They're in the minority at this point. So part of their intent is to be able to ramp up operations effectively for the bulk of spring tendering. I can tell you that there has been strong opinions registered by our contractors of late, directly to me and to Andrew and the President, that they want to continue working. And the impression we're getting is that by far the vast majority of employees want to continue working and to get the job done. There are employees that choose, don't feel safe and choose to leave the site, and that's being accommodated by all of our contractors. But we want it to be work as usual can be under these crazy circumstances that we now face at this point. So at this point, I'll turn it over to our President, James McVeety from Black & McDonald. James?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So following on Brian's observations, I'd like to offer my own as ORBA President and also representing a major contractor in the road building industry or the construction industry in general. We're seeing impacts to labor, supply chain. There's contractual uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. Contractors are seeing business as usual memos coming from a lot of public owners, which means the construction industry faces double jeopardy, required to carry on notwithstanding an unprecedented pandemic and all of its ramifications on operations, while potentially facing penalties, damages, and the need to mitigate where mitigation may not be achievable. So we think this on its face is inconsistent with expressed wishes of the provincial government that the construction industry soldier on, while at the same time offering economic support and relief in general to communities, individuals, and businesses. How do contractors and owners manage risk? That's the question we're all asking. The foundation of our approach to try and provide more certainty to all parties was sent to government for comment last week. And I guess at this point, I'll ask Andrew to briefly walk through our thoughts as ORBA.
So thanks, James. My name is Andrew Hurd, Director of Policy and Stakeholder Relations with ORBA. And I just want to say off the top that we were working on a deck to share with all of you today. But in light of some of the anticipation we had around the Premier's remarks at 1 o'clock today, we decided that we needed to travel as light as possible. So with Scott's permission, if any of you would like to see some of the language that I'm going to be addressing here, I can send that to you through Scott afterwards. Our essential ask to government right now, and to the Ministry of Transportation in particular, is on relief provisions. And we're really asking for a strong signal to be sent. We're asking for a clear policy statement supported by a commitment to future legislation or regulatory measures, which would basically allow or address how the ministry is going to be treating COVID-19 time and cost implications on current and future contracts. And an example could be a contractual or legislative provision for relief, including time and compensation, that's inserted into all contracts where the effects of COVID-19 result in failure to perform or delay. Another option could be to include bid qualifications in tendering processes. In discussions with MTO, I know that this might be inhibited right now by electronic tendering protocols, but we have provided draft qualification language as a suggestion to the ministry. And we think that allowing a contractor to bid in this manner would provide some of the necessities of alleviating the necessity of carrying significant risk contingency. And we're also looking at force majeure language in the broad sense. I know that RESCON and ORBA and a number of other associations that belong to the CDAO provided a submission to Queen's Park about 2 weeks ago. As a member of CDAO, ORBA is certainly supporting it. And that's trying to address language in various owner contracts and language in the MTO general conditions that may or may not cover the current situation. And to that end, CDAO has recommended that Ontario, and I quote, adopt a transparent and standardized force majeure clause retroactively into all contracts under the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. That includes quarantine restrictions and or epidemics as triggering events. And so we believe that this should maybe also provide a process for the owner and the contractor to decide whether performance of the work should be suspended. However, we believe as an association that any force majeure event is also in essence a relief event. And we certainly like to see language in that direction, providing for not just time extension, but also for reasonable compensation. And just a word here on holdback. I know everyone's probably aware of some of the suspension of limitations affecting the release of holdback that came about as I think the Lieutenant Governor enacted an order in council fairly recently. I think in my conversations with government anyways, I think that there's been some unintended consequences to contractor liquidity implications. And so we're asking the government to rectify this issue. And, I know Richard's very aware of this as well, but one option may be to include some language around exempting the Construction Act from provisions of the emergency reg that the Lieutenant Governor enacted on March 20th. And with that, Scott, back to you.
Okay, great. We've had a lot of questions put forward already, and I'm going to run through as many of these as I possibly can over the next 43 minutes. To begin with, the first sort of batch of questions that arose, we're looking at the idea of safety, worker safety specifically. And so Richard, based on what you're hearing, I wonder if you could elaborate what additional PPE is being required for workers who are working on site right now.
So, very good question. There's a whole range of issues, some of which are outlined in the guidelines. I want to first say that, every construction site is different, and whether it's civil, ICI, high-rise residential or low-rise residential subdivision work, you have some interesting challenges there. Like in subdivisions, you've got 3 or 4 builders on one site, and they all might have somewhat of a different approach. In the high rise, we are dealing with staggering shifts, keeping people separate, dealing with hoist activity, how many people can be on a hoist or in an elevator at a time. Things from the like lunchroom activities, that kinds of things, providing more services there, building more and providing more washing facilities and washroom facilities, and also maintaining them better. An awful lot of activity there, sanitizers, and various other items. There will be, I think, further developments on shields, for example. That seems to be the latest thing. And of course, things like, not so much in the area of masks yet, but really the distancing was the big issue. And then, of course, we've got companies that are procuring heat guns at gates. Of course, and that can be helpful, but of course, as we know that this is an asymptomatic disease, so you can have somebody who has it, doesn't know they have it, have no signs of having it, and unless they're actually tested, you wouldn't know they have it. So it's kind of a bit scary that way. We haven't had a lot of reports of incidents yet in terms of people having it. There was one in the civil area there was one general contractor, and then they shut down, did a deep cleaning, sent the other people home, contacted public health, followed the guidelines that way. And I'm actually quite pleased with the way the industry has responded. They've exceeded my expectations by and large with the care and attention brought to dealing with these issues. And of course, given the short time period, it's been frenetic, would be a good word to describe it, in terms of getting the various changes and so on in place. So the ministry's guidelines are really, those are the minimum guidelines. And we have, as I said at the beginning, companies responding above and beyond that with different measures. We're also looking at technologies to try and track workers down the road and where they've been and that kind of thing. So some innovation will kick in here, and then we're trying to limit. We're dealing with things like inspections now, and we started setting up a tracking of what different municipalities are doing with respect to that. Because we do have closing occupancy work that needs to be done, and looking at a variety of innovations there, some of which you can utilize technology to not require a physical attendance of an inspector in situations. And then, of course, we're looking at, well, if an inspector must be there, then what are the conditions under which inspector can visit the site, who can be there, and kind of thing to ensure safety in that regard. So that's actually advancing pretty quickly. There's a fair range of different responses out there. Starting with, we've had some instances where, well, we're not doing anything to, we're completely open to distance inspections and utilizing video and that kind of thing to do that work. So we're looking towards getting to a point where we'll have potentially a common approach to this across the province. But there's been tremendous cooperation with everyone involved on this, I have to say generally. And I'd like to also concur with one thing I heard today, and I think it's true, or was told, was that the people that are really paying the most attention on the job sites are the workers, which is great. Because of course we want to hear from them if they are concerned about something, because needless to say, that's very important to us.
Okay, and then Richard, just building off that, our expectation right now is that workers are working, that they're maintaining social distancing, or the 6-foot distance currently, correct?
The guideline says that you basically do the best you can on that, but we want to maintain that. So we've addressed that in a number of areas. We still have a couple of challenges right now. One is that where we have crews in certain situations that are picked up and go to a site together in a van. So there's certain efforts being made there to see how we can separate them in the commuting to the sites and back.
And then is it your understanding that the PPE would allow for those people engaged in this work to work more in closer proximity to one another, or that it would just be safer while they're maintaining that 6-foot separation?
No, the proximity has to be avoided as best we can. So it's not to be encouraged, it's to be discouraged. And it would be nice to get to a point where that distance could be maintained at all time. That's the sort of holy grail in this, but there are situations where people will be closer, and that's being addressed, of course.
Okay, I'm just going to switch gears here somewhat. One of the questions that's really been upvoted a lot online is with regards to how municipalities should handle contractor claims for costs associated with COVID health and safety protocol implementation on existing contracts. I guess I'd be looking to the ORBA folks to weigh in on where they're at, where their thinking is on this question.
Andrew, I think that's yours.
Sorry, I was fiddling with my screen trying to unmute, so I can hear the question again, please.
Yeah, just asking, the question's been posed, how should municipalities handle contractor claims for costs associated with COVID-19 health and safety protocol implementation on existing contracts?
So I don't have a concrete answer there, and I may look to Bryan and James there too, but I think, you know, I get the sense that all levels of government are trying to do their best at the moment, and you know, the essence of government, I guess, is making decisions with the best available information in a timely way. And to that end, I think, you know, some sort of signal, again, as I sort of prefaced in my remarks, I think goes a long way. We're hearing from some contractors on the municipal front that, you know, a handshake, a relationship goes a long way towards providing them with some confidence that, you know, health and safety is first and foremost, and then they'll really be dealing with this stuff on the back end when things normalize. So at this point, I don't know if we can ask any more of either owners or contractors beyond putting in place some of those relief provisions and hopefully retroactive at that to help alleviate the situation.
Did anyone else want to comment on this one?
Yeah, there's been some reports of, you know, certain players in the industry in dealing with other players demanding performance as if nothing had changed. And of course, that's not going to work very well. You know, in our sector, in the residential sector, the fact is that if we don't have people doing the work, then that's a problem on top of a problem. And having subtrades bankrupted over something like this isn't going to work either. So, but having said that, you know, we've got this incredible range of projects at different stages and different kinds of projects. So every situation is different, and will require different actions. Of course, as Andrew said, you know, we're trying to work on that holdback lien issue, and we've just about we've pretty much landed on a common ask of the government to address that, just as we did with the force majeure issue. And hopefully that will provide some clarity in this because cash flow is everything in this situation, which is, as we know, incredibly difficult because and as I said, every situation is different. So it depends. Some projects and some work is much more affected than others, but everything is affected. And so this is I think there's been a bit of a reality setting in now, too. That would be my observation, because this has all happened so suddenly. It's been very difficult to adjust in such a short period of time. But this is an outstanding area that does need to be addressed, and hopefully we'll get some further guidance from the province on this as per our requests.
Fair enough. I recognize sort of how this very fluid and ever-changing situation is making people's timelines become shorter and shorter. But it was also asked if these similar considerations should be built into contracts that are poised to go out for the current season and haven't actually already been posted yet. Municipal people are very good at posing questions.
Who did you want to answer?
I would defer to the expertise around the virtual table here in terms of who might be best positioned to respond.
Well, you know, I can only speak for the residential side, of course, and I know that to the extent that this affects municipalities, that some projects that are moving forward, some have been sort of put on a temporary hold because the immediate priority is the work that is near closing. The premiers have mentioned that a few times. We do have people that have made certain arrangements and are waiting for their new houses. And of course, you know, right across the board, the time that's lost here, because we were pretty much working at full capacity before this crisis happened, almost across the board. Of course, people, you know, we had a housing crisis, and we also had we've been doing a lot of work on apprenticeship and training reform for a reason. So this is this time that we're losing here in many instances, we will not be able to make up. And of course, I shudder to think about what might happen if for some reason we were at some point in time required to cease operations because this would be entirely new ground for us. It wouldn't be like, say, for example, when you have a strike and then after a strike you get back to work. We lose time there, but in a situation like this where the entire world has changed in the sense that the whole environment is kind of up in the air, that would be incredibly difficult. I think in terms of bidding or tendering new work in that activity, that has to take into consideration the uncertainty that we're faced with right now. We'll probably get more guidance from the province tomorrow, as indicated by the Premier, who is going to be releasing the data, some of the data, I guess, that the public hasn't been privy to yet on where this thing is going. I can tell you that from the way we're looking at it, that this will peak in sort of mid to late May, and then we might get a settling out, looks like around July, but it's still going to be with us because there's two things that are very real here. One is testing. Testing is absolutely critical, and it's not where it should be, but at least we're way better than, say, for example, the US, but it's still not where it should be because we really don't know with a high degree of certainty who's actually got this thing and where they're taking it. So the testing is critical, and then a vaccine. Until there's a vaccine, we're going to be operating in a different way. I mean, I'm hoping that at some point in time we have like a 15-minute test, and that we can say with certainty, for example, specifically related to construction, that we have a site where no one has it, and so then things can operate on a different footing. But we're not there yet.
Fair enough.
You know.
What advice would ORBA provide for work that hasn't been tendered yet? And we're thinking specifically here about less complex projects like a bridge rehabilitation or road reconstruction. Would your advice be municipalities to proceed, or should they wait? And perhaps you might be able to provide us a sense of what you're seeing happening across the province.
It's Andrew here. In terms of what we've sort of been seeing across the province, I think that James and Bryan answered that quite well, and I think it's much of a sameness with Richard's comments, although that's in a different sector. James, as a contractor, do you have any thoughts on that? I think that's really a tough question for us to answer, given that the situation is so fluid. Maybe I can just offer just a bookend to Richard's comment on contracts that are being tendered now. One of the major responsibilities of ORBA as an association as well is to ensure that there's fairness across the field, and that contractors of varying sizes can compete. And I'm sort of answering the last question here again, but I think it's really important that we don't get into a world in which only the big general contractors can compete. Those contractors that have big legal departments and can afford to bid a certain way, and knowing that the legal eagles can deal with this again on the back end. So I think it is extremely important for for some relief provisions as quickly as possible to start making themselves be seen in tenders that are going out now.
Okay, would you have any advice about how municipalities should be approaching the issue of deadlines that are actually contained, construction deadlines that are actually contained in those tendering documents?
One thing, if I could add, it's Richard here. One thing that's very real here is that we are now moving into a world that is going to require a much higher level and quality of communication because you know, different projects are different sectors are different. Certain things will be determined by, for example, if you have an area of work where the safety issues are really not significant because social distancing and so on is much easier to abide, and you know, that kind of thing. The safety issue, let's just say the safety issues aren't such a big deal. Then a big question is going to be supply chain, right? So do we have the materials? Do we have the certainty of that to know that we can do certain work within a certain period of time? Those things are all going to come to play in this, and of course that's going to require, I think, a much higher level of communication and cooperation that in order to just get things done. So, and there is various, I've read various things on this in terms of reactions to it and so on, but that is going to be needed.
Okay.
It's Bryan here. I'll make a comment that, having talked to a number of our contractors over the last while generally, but certainly this past week, and the uncertainty is of the biggest concern they have at this point. They have operations which require semblance of continuance of what they've been doing all the way along in order for them to exist in the future. So their honest comment is, we want to do business, we want projects to proceed. We understand that there are issues around that. We understand the requirements for the safety requirements, and they're more than willing. The people we've spoken to are more than willing to comply. Some of them are going out of their way to comply to the safety standards. So a large project that was to be tendered, they would say, we'd like to see it go. Of course, there's going to be some uncertainty in that whole situation that around relief provisions that Andrew's talked about, and hopefully we can see our way through that with discussions with government and provide some confidence that will be there. But I can tell you, generally, the contractors want to continue, and I was assured this morning by one of the contractors in their company that 90–95% of their staff would be willing to continue. They're comfortable with the safety standards they put in. There are always a few that are nervous in the company, and they're willing to accommodate those people and let them step aside and leave the site if that's necessary. But I think they want to continue working. They're concerned if everything stops, that they're concerned about their employees having difficulties in their life if this would be a extended stoppage. They're concerned about projects falling to the wayside and not coming back this year. And therefore, when we do come up and start running at full tilt again, that there would be difficulty trying to accomplish what's being asked of them at that time.
Hey, Bryan, I wanted to pick up on the idea of when we're through this and what the effects may be. Jesse Helmer, who's the Deputy Mayor of the City of London, has asked for sewer and road construction on commercial main streets and urban cores. A number of businesses are concerned that delaying planned public works projects will push those projects further along. The question just got upvoted here. Will push those construction projects further along into the quote unquote initial recovery period. What advice do you have for handling this, or what does industry hope might be put in place to mitigate this probability?
Boy, that's a challenge. I think there is, the whole situation has a degree of uncertainty attached to it for obvious reasons. I mean, usually our people that are doing this type of work are the type that are doing today's work because of how they thought about it yesterday, and today they're thinking about tomorrow and what projects are coming up. So they plan well in advance, and it's a continuous cycle. The difficulties they face now is that there is a large tunnel in front of them and the door isn't open yet. And so they're having difficulty planning for the future. I think the longer we continue, I mentioned earlier, the longer we continue to work in the safest way we can and still accomplish the goal of beating this virus, as long as we can do it safely, the longer we can continue to work, we don't face that ramp up after the recovery begins. It's essential. The number of people employed in this industry across this province, across Canada, but for us across this province, is huge. And the end result of that, with people being laid off and things shutting down completely, other than by choice, because we respect the fact that some companies will choose and have chosen already to step down. But I think it will just delay the inevitable, and those projects now will be put off further and further into the future, and it will be hard to play catch up at that point, I think.
Does anyone else want to jump in or elaborate on that? It's okay if not. We have lots of questions. We'll keep moving forward. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to add something to that. Sorry, I thought I was unmuted, but I wasn't. You know, we're losing time that we are not going to, or we're going to have serious problems trying to make up if we get back to some kind of normal, whenever that is. But I think, as I said earlier, that's going to be a ways down the road. Some companies have shut down for a while. Some builders did, just to regroup, and that's great. That was many of them are coming back online. I think some stopped because in anticipation of possibly the government shutting us down. There has been, of course, a couple of sub-trades and one union that have been pushing, and they have a lobbyist working for them, a thing called the Ontario Construction Consortium, asking for a 2-week shutdown. We have not agreed to that because it's really a fiction. And the reason why it's a fiction is that the rates are the numbers of afflicted are going to continue to increase. I mean, we just had 1 million people come back to the province untested from God knows where. And I think we're seeing those numbers ramp up now. But there's no way, if the government were to shut down our industry for 2 weeks, there's no way we would reopen in 2 weeks, because the numbers will be higher. And of course, they would be vilified severely for, well, why did you shut it down then and you want to open it up now when the numbers are higher? That just does not make any sense whatsoever, and it doesn't. There's an example here too. The city of Boston shut down for 2 weeks and it didn't start up again. And the reason why is the numbers got higher. So I'm very confident our industry, by and large, is doing a remarkable job pivoting to this. And I think we can, I have no doubt about this, work safely. Is it 100% safe? No, but my comment on that is nothing is 100% safe right now. The consequences, given the timelines, you know, as I mentioned before about May and July and so on, the consequences of shutting down the construction industry in Ontario, which is really we're the #1 industry in Ontario, and it's really kind of a construction economy in many respects, would be a complete disaster. And then trying to be like, I think of it as, trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again at the end of this. As I said before, I've had experience in getting things moving again after a strike. This would be nothing like that. It would be so much harder. And of course, we do have, people have said, well, why is construction essential and so on? Well, we've actually measured the health consequences, both mental and physical, of inadequate housing and inadequate transit. And we know we already have a major deficit in both those areas. That is, would just be made worse, and there are real consequences to that. I don't mean to necessarily compare that to what's happening right now with COVID. Of course, it's not the same, but there are serious consequences there right across the board. As I said, there's some areas of construction that are not necessarily immediate right now. Like, for example, do you really have to remodel your kitchen now, or can that wait for 6 months or a year? Well, yeah, it can. But in terms of the housing requirements we have, and the transit requirements, the infrastructure requirements, and the building we have to do there, I think we can do that and can do that. Some people have compared us to, say, for example, New York State and so on and so forth, and that, well, look what happened there. And we're saying, in response to that, well, we're not New York. The US numbers are 10 times greater than our numbers. And thankfully, we're managing a bit better. But we'll see what the Premier says tomorrow, though, with respect to some of the data there that they're looking at. But we need to keep whatever elements or aspects of construction moving forward through this as best we can. I would also say that other economies like the Asian nations that were, the Koreas, the Taiwans, the Singapores, and the Hong Kong have kept work proceeding while they tackled the pandemic, and I think we are. I think we can manage that. But that's my opinion, of course.
Okay, so in the spirit of keeping things going, Nelson Carvalho from my hometown of Leamington asks, what assurances private sector can provide to municipal workers that when they enter a construction site, all of the workers on that site have gone through the protocols established by their health and safety reps?
Maybe I can start. It's Andrew here, and I think somewhere in the vicinity of 46% of our major members, so those would be general contractors and contractor producers, are core certified, and cooperation with the IHSA in all aspects is actually baked into our ORBA code of conduct. So we take all of that extremely seriously, and I think it's been well said here that safety is job number one. Many of our companies are family-run companies, and the workforce, they're not just workers, they're family. And, not to put too fine a point on it, but I think as well, I'm an outsider. I come from the provincial government, and one of the things that's really impressed me with the construction industry is the emotional intelligence. And I see that around the board table, and I see it on sites. You're going to size someone up that's standing next to you, because if you can't trust them, it's a matter of life and death. So I think that's very well represented in the construction sector.
Hi, it's Richard. I'd also say that, we're an industry that is steeped in health and safety. We've got a very elaborate and well-developed health and safety system. Every employer is required to have their procedures. They're required to post them. There is a duty and a requirement to, educate the workforce that's there, all the employers, that's subtrades, generals, and so on. We do have health and safety committees on our sites, and I'm speaking of the, I'll call it the established professional industry. I'm not referring to necessarily to, like renovation operations, things like that. We do have health and safety consultants. We do have ministry inspectors. So we've got a very robust health and safety system. And just as I mentioned earlier, I've been very impressed with the response from the industry and the care and attention devoted to making sites as safe as possible, and the attention given to that whole effort. And I have not heard one complaint from anyone that I've talked to, and I deal with it in a certain way, as you can imagine, but that, well, this is going to cost money or something like that. No, that hasn't come up. It's been really all hands on deck on this, and I've been really impressed with the cooperation between sectors and are working together through the CDAO with the government. You know, it's been impressive, and as I said, it's a robust system.
Okay, the next question comes from Jeff Carlton. He asks if we can elaborate, or if you can elaborate on the explanation that was provided of the relief measure. Is this something that would delay municipal tendering if it's added and imposes a series of extra costs?
I think if it's retroactive, if again, you know, there's probably some way to again send a signal to industry and owners that something is coming down the pipe. And I know that in some of our conversations with certain agencies, we know that, you know, comments have been made back to us that you know, we didn't cause COVID-19, the owners didn't cause COVID-19, and there is an acknowledgement that things need to be made right. I certainly, you know, again, to Richard's comments earlier, we're certainly not hoping that anything is delayed because of this. I think it's sort of a wait and see approach, given the situation may be very fluid, and construction may be further defined in terms of an essential service tomorrow. And in that context, maybe we can afford to you know, really take a look at what provisions can be put in place as a stopgap, if nothing else, at this stage.
Okay, and then just a number of people have asked various sort of interpretations of how force majeure may impact contracts that are existed. I guess, Andrew, I turn to you again, since you were the one who brought it up initially. How do you see the realities of this pandemic interacting with the concept of force majeure?
So I'm going to answer that on a very narrow basis, and then I would look to my colleagues to maybe fill in the blanks. But in looking at the MTO GCs, you know, the MTO doesn't have a formal sort of force majeure section, but it does have force majeure language. And I think one of the clauses, you know, applies to, sorry, it's not right in front of me here, so it sort of escapes me, but the order is from an official body or public health agency. And, you know, I've had conversations with MTO saying, you know, look, there's nothing in here that expressly provides for protection for this current pandemic situation. If we were to look at exercising and claiming under a certain clause, would this sort of, you know, follow, if your workers are having to self-isolate because they're following the dictates of the chief health officer, would that be covered? And the answer, again, in a without prejudice comment here is, look, government's not looking to go out and jam anyone here. We are looking to be probably fairly generous coming out of this. It's just a question right now of focusing on immediate priorities before us, and we'll eventually get around to that.
James or Brian, did you want to elaborate on what Andrew started with?
I don't think I can comment further on that. I think Andrew's pretty well covered it.
Okay. What impacts are you seeing amongst your members? And again, this would be specifically for the ORBA folks. Are you seeing the use of more electronic tendering? Are there other sort of unexpected trends that you may be seeing happening in terms of project management that are a direct result or can trace their origins back to the COVID-19 crisis?
Scott, can I just ask, I think James is trying to weigh in here.
Yeah.
I think he's having trouble accessing the line.
Oh,
Can you just check on that? Thanks.
Yeah.
While we're waiting, I was going to say that one of the things that's going to happen here is we're going to be and are developing new ways of doing business. There is going to be, I think, considerable developments relative to things like e-permitting and in the area of inspections, how we organize work. We're going to know a lot more about how we do things. I think it's going to really, although longer term, and there was already a bit of a trend here, but in terms of offsite construction, modular, panelized type activities will be encouraged by this, and some things that otherwise might have taken a long time to do, we're dealing with now. We've done a lot of things in the last few weeks already that would have taken many months to have achieved, and they're happening rapidly. So it's going to be very interesting. Somebody said you never want to waste a good disaster. You try to make change and introduce innovation.
James, are you able to you should be able to speak now, I think.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh, can everybody hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you crystal clear.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, maybe I'll just circle back to another point that was made.
Sure.
You know, aside from contractors looking for fair and reasonable relief on their contracts, and again, no one really knows what the mechanism will look like as long as, I guess, both sides treat it reasonably. I think we also have to look at opportunities. Like we heard the prefabrication example, but for road builders, there's also the opportunity as well with the reduced traffic volumes and things like that. Maybe the owners or procurers of construction can look at, you know, extended lane closure periods, full closures, extensions on noise bylaw restrictions, things of that nature, so it can temper, I guess, the effects of either productivity loss or things like that that the contractor might encounter, or it might extend their workday from a 5-hour shift because that's the only time you're allowed to either enter the right of way or the highway, and the contractor can actually execute a full shift with its resources. So there are opportunities out there to mitigate. It's just that everybody has to evaluate and look at them together.
Okay. The clock's proving to be our enemy here, so maybe we can just shift to a more uplifting note given we have 2 minutes left. The top of the pile right now in terms of the questions being posed comes from Nasser Mahmoud. He's asking, do we need to come up with a long-term strategy to deal with this type of issue? And I'm assuming he means the pandemic, or let's say more broadly, some sort of unexpected or unanticipated crisis within the construction industry. In particular, what, as industry representatives, what do you think municipalities could be doing in terms of how they manage these sorts of unseen variables when putting new tenders out or developing new contracts? Do you want to start with that one, Richard?
Wow. Well, I think, sure. Okay. You know, we don't directly contract with municipalities to the same degree as other sectors do, but I think what we're in right now is going to have long-term repercussions on how we do business. That might sound trite, but it's the way it's going to be. And I think COVID is going to, until we get a vaccine, it's going to be with us for a long time. And this is going to sound kind of bizarre, and I hopefully, but we're lucky right now. I think we will get through COVID. But imagine if you had something that was transmitted that's like a COVID, but was closer to a SARS type virus with a, say, much deadlier, you know, so I think we can learn from, we're going to learn lessons from this, and I think that they will be reflected in various developments in terms of how to handle a future pandemic beyond this one. I think that we have to plan that there will be something beyond this, and it might be much worse, but hopefully we would be and will be, I don't doubt that at all, better prepared for this. I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is that we're going to develop, we're going to learn that, and as we've learned already, there are things and practices that we've had in the past that we don't have to keep doing things that way. Like, for example, just in what we're doing right now, that we can communicate much more effectively and don't have to have those face meetings that we had before. And that in terms of, you know, as I mentioned, the area, say, for example, of e-permitting, we will, I think this will really spur us into a paperless process that's going to be much more sophisticated. In my world, it will be a BIM-based GIS type system, a way of doing business, and which fits into, of course, offsite construction as well too. So,
Brian,
you know,
Brian, what impacts do you think we're likely to see as a result of this long term?
Well, I think we're going to learn an awful lot of lessons through this, and it is for one thing, it's made us look very seriously on the type of things that are contained in our contracts to make sure that everyone understands the terms and how it could be interrupted by something, not just on a short term, but we could get into something like we faced here, and therefore can affect the outcome of a contract. And I think we're going to think differently going forward on how we enter into, on both sides of the fence, on how we enter into contracts and make sure that allowances are made for this type of thing to happen. God help us, we don't want it to happen again. But I think it's an important thing that we'll have to, it's always been there, I guess, and now is the time that's brought it to our attention full throttle. So I think it's time for us to think about the future and how we prepare ourselves for working together going down the road.
Well, I think those are good words for wrapping up this session. I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us today. I think it was a good conversation, an enlightening conversation. We could have probably talked for 3 or 4 hours about this based on the number of questions that were posed. I would invite everyone online, if they have further questions, please reach out to me, scott@ogra.org. That's SCOTT@ogra.org. And I'll do my best to get any other outstanding questions put to our panelists. Looking forward, we are doing a panel next week looking at a broad host of municipal issues. And then the intention is, having heard from the private sector on this issue, we'll also be convening a panel looking specifically at what municipalities are doing vis-a-vis road contracts and road construction projects to manage this crisis. Thanks again to everyone. I wish everyone 6 feet of personal space and good health. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you, Aaron.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.